I've never told the story on camera, and mostly because I didn't think anybody would care to hear the story, but I was telling the story to a friend of mine recently, and he said, why don't you just tell that story on your YouTube channel? And I said, okay, here we are. So many people have asked me what it was like to hang around with Paul Walker and be his friend. Well, honestly, it's not like we were super tight, other than working with him on set and then traveling with him to a few car shows because Universal paid us to do that. It's not like we hung around often or went to parties together or anything like that. So we basically work buddies, and then barely that. That story is coming up right after the break. I don't know if you know this, but I actually now have a merch store, and if you haven't checked out the video description below my videos, then you're missing out. Currently, I've got a pack full of movie quote t-shirts, and more styles are being added every month, and new items are in development right now. So have a look, see if there's anything you like, and wear it with pride. The link is in the video description below. Frankly, I'm not one to suck up to movie stars, and back in 2000, Paul Walker was hardly a movie star. I think he did a couple of movies before that. I didn't really follow the trajectory of his career, but I had very limited knowledge about him, and then, that was probably not an audience for those movies anyway. But I do remember the first time that Universal sent Paul and I to car shows to promote the Fast and Furious. Basically, we were going to car shows up and down the West Coast. This happened in late 2001, around the time of the movie's release, and a little bit into 2002, if I'm not mistaken. But it was weird because although people lined up for his autograph, most people didn't even know who he was, but they saw the Fast and Furious banner behind him and figured he was probably something important. But what they did like is the R34 Skyline GTR that we took to some of those shows. And that was not my car, it was actually Paul Walker's car. So let me get this straight for you guys. At that one show where we brought a silver Skyline GTR, there's a great story about it. Basically, that car was Paul's personal GTR. This was before Too Fast, Too Furious was even announced. In fact, I had heard nothing about that movie at that particular time. At this time, I still had my orange Supra, but I was toying with the idea of buying an R34 GTR. And by this time, I had got to know Paul a bit better. And when we went to these shows, we talked about cars for hours. It was just to pass the time at these shows. So it's not like we were bonding and be buddies and like hanging out after work, that kind of stuff, but I did get to know him a little bit. So when we were doing these car show promotions, we basically made appearances at hot import nights in San Mateo, another one down in Mission Bay, and another event in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of stuff going on right at that time. So I may have missed a couple of details. But when I first met Paul, he was a muscle car guy. Apparently he had a nice 1966 Chevy too. But apparently working around tuner cars sparked his interest in those kinds of cars, and so that he started diversifying his affection, I guess you can say. And while he liked the Supra, I often told him that the R34 GTR was the king of the hill in that segment. I told him about the history of the GTR as much as I knew about it, and apparently he already knew about the GTR because I remember he had discussions about the GTR with Sean Morris back at the casting call for the first movie, and so he got a little taste of it there. Sean Morris was the guy who was doing that, and Sean at the time was working for Hero at Motorex at the time. Sean did not own Motorex. He just worked for Hero, so I want to be very clear about that. Honestly, all those talks I had with Paul, I'm not sure if I talked him into the GTR or did I talk myself into a GTR, but that's just the way it kind of happened. So at one point, Paul suggested that we go up to Motorex and have a look around. I said, okay, let's go. So I met him up there, and at the time, Motorex was the only company going through the legal process of certifying GTRs for importation into the United States. That's when they were legitimate. A few years later, all that unraveled. That's a whole other story, and another whole other video that I did a year ago. Sean Morris, as I said, was working for Hero at Motorex at the time, and so we looked around. I had some discussions with Sean and also Ken Takahashi, and so then Paul and I went our separate ways. And at the time, Paul and I were just wrapping up our obligations to the Fast and Furious movie, the first one at least. And again, the second one had not even been discussed with anybody. So apparently, Paul went back to Motorex soon after that discussion, and he was ready to buy a car. He wanted a silver one, as I understand it, but the only GTR that they had was the Blackbird, which is a car that would personally belong to Hero, the owner, and that was going through the certification process at that particular moment, and it wouldn't be available for a little while to be sold. But Hero loaned the Blackbird to Paul, and Paul drove it around for a couple of months while he was waiting for his car to come in. In fact, there was actually a video of him driving that car. It was featured on some kind of DVD featurette from a company that makes DVDs about cars back then. In the video, he did not really make it clear that it was not his car. He did mention my name, but at the time I had no attachment to the car. I had not committed to buying that car. But at some point, Hero loaned Paul another car, a customer's car, a Bayside blue car, which became the BF Goodrich poster car, which recently sold at auction for about $577,000 or something like that. And that was the car that came from the Hive garage. They had it for a little while and then they just sold it at auction. But in the time back then, around June of 2001, Motor Trend took the Blackbird out to the track to feature that car in their magazine. They were doing instrumented test sessions, and they found out that the Blackbird did 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, and the Blackbird ran a 12.2 quarter mile at 113 miles an hour. And so it was pretty healthy and pretty stout. And then around July of 2001, it went back to Motorex. It seemed that now Hero was ready to sell the Blackbird. And after a little back and forth, a little bit of discussion, a little bit of negotiation, I gave them a $15,000 deposit on it to buy it. So we were still waiting on some paperwork for the car, and I was going to take a couple of months, so they hung on to my deposit, and I went about my business. And then in the first week of October 2001, the Motor Trend magazine came out, and then on October 10th, I picked up the car. But we still had one more appearance to do, Paul and I, to promote Fast and Furious. And the first time I saw Paul's silver Skyline was at the San Mateo Hot Import Nights event when Universal shipped it up there to the show, because my Supra was committed elsewhere, and the GTR, as I said, went to the SEMA show and into the HRE Wheels booth. And because of that, there's no way I could risk anything happening to the GTR, so it was committed to SEMA, and that's where it went. If you saw it that year, it had two sets of wheels, one set of wheels on one side and a different style on the other side. And this was all the handiwork of Bob Hale. Bob Hale worked at HRE. He was my first call whenever I was building cars back then. When we built my Uber M3, when we built the Terminator 350Z, Neil Chin and I, and then another project that Neil Chin and I worked together on was the Need for Speed Underground R34 GTR. And of course, my GTR, the one that became the Too Fast and Furious GTR, also got HRE wheels. Now, at the time at the SEMA show, my car was still black, but I knew a color change was coming. I had big plans for that car. And in order to get the exposure for the sponsors that I had already lined up, I had to make sure that magazines would actually feature the car in their pages. But working for the parent company of Super Street Magazine taught me that black cars do not get much exposure in magazine or a lot of coverage. And so I decided to paint it a bright color as I was consulted to do. And I painted it blue and then borrowed the Signal Auto livery. And I think you've seen pictures of that. If not, you'll see it here. And then in the spring of 2002, I was recruited, of course, to work on Too Fast, Too Furious. And they decided on using an R34 GTR, and surprise, I just happened to have one in the parking lot, and so they chose that car. But it was blue at the time, so the Universal decided to paint it to silver, which was not a factory color. It was actually a House of Color paint code. It was called Platinum Pearl. I think it was PBC 42 from House of Color. And then some time passed as we prepared for Too Fast, Too Furious, and I hadn't seen Paul in months, but I saw him at the driving school we were doing for the actors for Too Fast, Too Furious that was held in the parking lot of some kind of sports arena, I forget which one it was, but it was pretty much in the middle of Miami. And then when he learned that my car was going to be the Hero car, he simply said, "It figures." And then he asked me if I had anything to do with getting GTRs into the movie. And I said it was one of the suggestions I made, and they went with it. So Paul's first GTR was Sonic Silver, as I recall. Paul indeed had several R34 GTRs during his life, including a QM1 or white car, and I think one other one. And the white car at one point was adorned with an HKS livery for some sort of promotion. And then over the years, he picked up a couple of R32s as well. And so we just kind of parted ways after that movie. And the last time I saw him was in 2009. I was at Willow Springs filming, and Paul showed up with Richie and the AE group. They brought an R35 GTR, a BMW E46 race car, a couple of 996 Porsches, and maybe another car or two. I don't remember. I have to look back at the footage. On that same day, Jason Statham was learning learning there too, learning how to drift in a 350Z. Apparently they were getting ready for Fast 5, I think it was at that time. And Daryl Allison was there with his red R34. He and Paul were actually very good friends. They did car events together. Daryl helped build the Fast 4 GTR for the Fast 4 movie, and he stored cars for Paul and built cars for Paul and all that kind of stuff. And most of you already know that Paul loved many cars. Mustangs, lightweight BMWs, muscle cars, tuner cars, especially the Mark IV Supra. But I know that the R34 GTR at one point was among his favorites. Had he lived till today, I'd have to wonder which car he would love the best. I think he would be a big fan of the GT3 Porsche RS. So if you ask me what he was like, he was just the kind of guy that you hoped he would be. He's just a chill, down-to-earth dude who loves surfing, guns, cars, and just having fun and hanging out with his friends. So he was just one of us. And my favorite moment with Paul was on set in Miami at night. It was a quiet moment while we were waiting. You know, if you've ever been on a movie set, it's basically a few minutes of actual action and a period of time waiting for a reset to move the lights, to move the cameras, and get everything set up and get everything ready for the next shot. And so there's a lot of downtime in between those takes. So I was just sitting there leaning against the cars. I always stayed where the cars were. And I just asked him in part of a discussion, do you like making movies? Is this a big deal? I mean, is it hard work or what? He said, I'm not really an actor, but they keep paying me to be in these movies. But if the movie has guns, cars, or surfing, I'm in. That was about as real as you can get, man. He didn't consider himself an actor. He was very humble that way. And after that chance reunion in 2009 at Willow Springs, I never saw him again. Then on November 30th, 2013, at a little after 3:30 in the afternoon, I got the phone call. He and Roger Rodas had just died in a car accident, and the person who, I don't even remember who called me. I don't remember if it was Sean or Richie or some, I don't even remember. It was just horrible, and it was just, the rest of the afternoon was a blur. As tragic as it was more so because Paul, honestly, was perhaps the best ambassador for the car hobby we've ever had, not to mention the terrible loss for Paul's family, friends, and cousins. And honestly, no one on the Fast and Furious cast list today or ever before has been as passionate about cars as Paul was. He was the true car guy in there. Most of the people who work on that franchise may have a couple of cars, but not like Paul. And so this week on the 9th anniversary, we remember our friend and the best ambassador this hobby has ever had, Paul Walker. We miss you, buddy. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.